We are sentient creatures first and foremost. The most fundamental reality is not external but internal. It is one's capacity for pain and pleasure. It is this capacity that defines our existence as sentient beings. When I make such claims, a certain philosophical hypothetical is occasionally invoked. This philosophical hypothetical was intended to disprove hedonism. Hedonism is often regarded as being very surface level in terms of its engagement with pain and pleasure. It is far more animalistic and far less considered than the reasoning that I employ. It is associated with an animalism, a shallow, unreasoned, and short-sighted engagement with sentience that differs greatly from my often abstract reasoning. At least that is how hedonism is viewed by a great many. In spite of this difference, some consider this hypothetical to also be applicable to my own views. The philosophical hypothetical in question is Robert Nozick's pleasure machine hypothetical. The hypothetical invokes a fictional machine, which is capable of providing one with all the pleasure they could desire. The question at the core of the hypothetical is simple. Would you choose this machine over the real world? Would you choose a specially designed pleasure machine over real life if doing so seemingly guaranteed you access to greater pleasure? The idea behind the hypothetical is that nobody would choose the pleasure machine, meaning that pleasure must not be the all-powerful force that hedonists think it is. Do note that my conception of the basis of reason does not just consist of pleasure, but also pain, something this hypothetical is not so concerned with. I think that this hypothetical has some issues. Firstly, it discounts the idea that we may wish to avoid the machine for irrational reasons. Human irrationality does not necessarily disprove hedonism. A deeply irrational means does not necessarily indicate that one is not seeking a particular end. Bad political advocacy demonstrates this quite well. Some supporters of prison reform will call themselves prison abolitionists. This is idiotic rhetoric which makes them look far worse than they really are. They are strawmanning themselves, transforming great ideas into ridiculous caricatures. Their rhetoric hinders the achievement of their goals. This irrational rhetoric does not necessarily indicate that they do not aim at prison reform. I think that many of them do pursue prison reform. They just do so through blatantly irrational means. An irrational pursuit of an end does not necessarily prove that one does not aim at that end. The same can be said of one's pursuit of pleasure. This is particularly true of pleasure because the pursuit of pleasure is often hardly even conscious. It is baked into the very depths of sentient consciousness. This often leads to a lack of awareness that creates a capacity for massive irrationality. One can hardly be expected to rationally pursue an end that they are unaware of. And it is perfectly possible for the cardinal drive to be unknown. Philosophy has implied this through its constant attempts at unearthing such a drive. Just because pleasure is the ultimate good doesn't mean we will always pursue it in rational ways. People constantly do things which prevent them from accessing pleasure. Often because short-term pleasure is put before long-term pleasure. The comforting idea comes before the one which has a greater capacity to serve one's interests. Human irrationality explains a great deal. This truth reaches out far beyond this particular hypothetical. The pleasure machine hypothetical is better at demonstrating human irrationality than disproving hedonism. While people do always seek pleasure, they sometimes do so in irrational ways. The idea of the pleasure machine may trigger discomfort, the fear of the unknown. people may run away from it because rejecting such things is associated with pleasure. They prefer the short-term pleasure of comfort that is associated with the known over the far greater pleasures of the discomforting unknown. This short-sightedness, weakness, and irrationality does not disprove the power of pleasure. It was only because of the pleasure associated with comfort that the machine was rejected. People understand the pleasures of the real world. They may regard the notion of artificial pleasure with suspicion. They prefer a pleasure that they know is good over one that they have never experienced. The hypothetical is often modified to remove such concerns. It is often said that the pleasure machine provides pleasure that is indistinguishable from real pleasure. But concerns persist nonetheless. Rationality is far from assured. I think that a key component of the rejection of the pleasure machine lies in the assumption that it provides only hollow pleasures. Hollow pleasures of the kind that hedonism has often been associated with. The pleasures of sex, drinking, and eating. People want higher quality varieties of pleasure, such as satisfaction, fulfillment, and meaning. Many people may not consider these things to be pleasure at all. They may assume that they will be lost as one leaves the real world. I regard meaning, satisfaction, and fulfillment as variants of pleasure. Pleasure is simply that almost indescribable good feeling. It is a word that only the sentient will ever understand, but they will understand it well. It has many sources, some of them of the shallow variety, often associated with hedonism, and others associated with higher ways of living. I use pleasure in the broadest sense to describe good feeling. Under the large umbrella of pleasure comes countless words: happiness, contentment, enjoyment, meaning, fulfillment, satisfaction. It may very well be that we reject the machine because we assume that it offers only hollow pleasures and lesser pleasures, not the higher pleasures of real life. We choose real life, not in a rejection of pleasure, but an embrace of its higher forms, namely meaning, fulfillment, and satisfaction, which we very often do not regard as forms of pleasure at all. The rejection of the pleasure machine may not disprove the power of pleasure, but instead demonstrate the power of higher forms of pleasure. We reject the pleasure machine out of a desire to maintain mental comfort, and because we want to remain in a reality that allows us to feel satisfaction, fulfillment, and meaning. We don't reject the machine because we don't care about pleasure, but precisely because we value it. Of course, all of these contentions can easily be dismissed if the hypothetical is modified slightly to surely provide greater meaning, fulfillment, and satisfaction. In that case, refusing it becomes blatantly irrational. It becomes evidence of human irrationality, as opposed to an argument against hedonism. It becomes evidence of our preference for short-term pleasure, in the form of comfort at the prospect of not having to face something unknown, even when the unknown offers far greater pleasures. Human irrationality does not disprove my views. People always act in a manner informed by pain and pleasure, but that interaction comes in more and less rational forms. Some are aware of the forces that dominate the sentient experience, others are not. Some favour a short-sighted and intuitive interaction. Others favour a more considered and thoughtful one. Some people forge more rational relationships with their gods than others. Some thoughtfully consider and logically advance from the basis of reason. Others aren't even consciously aware of that basis. Their ignorance, their irrationality, does not indicate its falsity, only their own idiocy.